This week on Africa Update, African countries sent delegation to Addis Ababa as African Union marks 60th anniversary. Is Africa more united than 6 decades ago? We examine Africa's journey towards integration. Also on the program, we'll look at 200 years old Sierra Leone's iconic cotton tree felled by the storm. This is Africa Update on Trust TV, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. I am Ayuba Ilia. Thanks for joining. Now, on May 25th, 1963, 32 heads of independent African states met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, along with leaders from African liberation movements to craft a way forward for Africa's complete independence from imperialism, colonialism, and apartheid. The outcome of the meeting was the creation of Africa's first post-independence continental institution, the Organization of African Unity, OAU. Here is what you need to know about the Africa Day.
On May 25th, 2023, Africa will commemorate the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, which later became the African Union. This annual commemoration, known as Africa Day, is a significant occasion that symbolizes unity, progress, and the ongoing struggle for freedom and independence in Africa. Here's what you need to know about the origins of Africa Day. In May 1963, 32 heads of independent African states met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to sign a charter creating Africa's first post-independence continental institution, the Organization of African Unity. OAU's effort advocating for political independence and supporting liberation movements culminated in the historic abolition of apartheid in South Africa in the 90s. On September 9, 1999, the heads of state and government of the OAU adopted the Sirte Declaration in Sirte, Libya, calling for the transformation of the organization into a new and expanded continental organization named the African Union. The African Union was officially launched in July 2002 in Durban, South Africa. May 25, 2023 will mark the 60th anniversary of Africa Day, which will be celebrated under the slogan, Our Africa, Our Future, and the theme Acceleration of AfCFTA, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, implementation, according to the AU. Africa Day is observed by many African nations, but it's actively celebrated as a public holiday in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Senegal, and Tanzania.
Now, the OAU was formed as a manifestation of the Pan-African vision for an Africa that was united, free, and in control of its own destiny. Now, over the last 6 decades, several frameworks have been created to realize the vision of the African Union. One of these strategic frameworks is the Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, which was signed by the African heads of states and government on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the AU in 2013. In line with the vision of the Agenda 2063, some of the attempts to integrate the African continent is manifested in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the ongoing conversation around the AU single passport and the single currency. But how integrated is the continent of Africa after 6 decades of the AU's existence? Joining us to talk about this is Ogbole Ode, Nigeria's former ambassador and former spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he will be giving us perspectives to some of the stories and to this great day, Africa Day. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Africa Update, Mr. Ogbole.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Well, let me begin by asking, how integrated is the African continent after 6 decades of the AU?
Counting from 1960, when most African countries became independent, onwards up to today, I may want to score reasonably well the awareness of Africans, governments and people for the imperative to be united. I say this because on the run-up to the formation of the OAU in 1963, there were two camps, the conservative camp marked by the Monrovia group and the other one much more progressive that had the Nkrumahs who are in the lead, the progressive wanted African unity total and complete now and immediate. However, the Monrovia group, the conservative group where we found ourselves, were more after a gradual progress towards unification of the entire continent. 60 years on, after the formation, I think some steps, some mileage, no matter how small, has been covered. For example, each of the four regions have an economic community to its credit, beginning with the East African community, economic community, the economic community of West African states where we belong in West Africa, SADC, the Maghreb Arab Union to the north, and all. These are envisaged to be the building blocks for a continental unity, from a regional step by step, then interlocking themselves to become an African unity across the entire continental landscape. That has done, and so far they are functioning. The fact that they are in existence, ECOWAS is in existence, ECOWAS is vibrant. ECOWAS has, for example, extended its purview beyond economic community to have an ECOWAS parliament and an ECOWAS regional court.
Mm. Oh, well, I mean, critical factor to consider in the integration of African continent will be the ease of movement of Africans within Africa. Very recently, Nigerian students from Sudan who are evacuating the conflict there had a serious challenge passing through Egypt on the account that they didn't have the required documents to pass through just by, passing through. So that's an example of, the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of movement of African countries. It's not the same case in the EU. When the Russia-Ukraine war started, we saw how easy it was for some of the Europeans to leave Ukraine to, neighboring countries and the likes. But it's not the same with us here. What do you make of, integration in terms of freedom of movement of Africans across the continent?
Yes, I agree with you. In terms of movement of goods and people across the common borders of African countries, there's a lot of mileage to be covered. Structures, yes. When I spoke earlier, I spoke of the structures that are on ground, that are functioning. But have the structures delivered? The answer is a vehement no. Movement of people across our common borders still face the difficulty that was faced maybe 40, 50 years ago. Our heads of states and government and all those who are in the position to execute the policies of the continental body may have to go onto the drawing board and exert themselves the more in order to make this realistic, that we have to deliver in marching forward to continental unity, that a people-to-people relationship in terms of movement of people across our common borders is made much easier, not only in terms of crossing the border, but in terms of the cost to do so, in terms of the convenience to do so. I recall sometime in 2014, there was the AU summit that came up and was held in Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea, and the delegation from Nigeria traveling to Equatorial Guinea had to fly first to Addis Ababa and then on to Malabo. So the delegation first traveled east before coming back to West Africa, as it were. Meanwhile, a straight flight from Abuja to Malabo was just 55 minutes. So in terms of aviation, in terms of shipping, in terms of monetary union, in terms of movement of goods and people across the border, there's still a lot of work, a lot of mileage to be covered.
What's the status of the AU single passport so far? What are the steps that have been taken? We understand there have been conversations around that, but not many Africans really are fully aware and, of this AU single passport and whether or not it is enough to guarantee, access into certain territories.
I wouldn't want to comment on that because I have not looked and followed the details of development in that axis. However, if we focus on the regional body where we belong, ECOWAS has done well coming up with an ECOWAS common passport. The only indication is that your country's name will be stamped on it, but ECOWAS logo will be on the passport. Now, possession of an AU passport, African passport, will it guarantee movement of people across the common borders if the attitude is wrong, but the paper, the travel document is right? This is a question to be answered.
Why do you think it has lingered for this long? Are there other threats to this? For instance, maybe security concerns, given the fact that we've seen rising cases of insecurity across the continent?
Perhaps, because especially in the Sahel region, Africa south of the Sahel, toward the West African axis of the Sahel, there have been increases since the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. There has been an increase in trafficking of small arms and light weapons across the borders flowing down south, which has accentuated the security situation or insecurity in the entire region, with a massive epicenter of it happening within our own national borders and national space, Nigeria. So consideration for security may be on the minds of those who are supposed to implement this policy. Okay.
Well, yet another issue, the issue of single currency for ECOWAS, for instance. The ECO has been much talked about issue for at least over 30 years since the whole idea was conceived. But till now, all we've seen is postponement after postponement, and now the ECOWAS is looking at 2027 for the realization of that. Why has it lingered for this long? I mean, and how important is that?
In consolidating in the gains, if any, of regional integration of our economies, a single currency or the importance of a single currency, common currency, cannot be overemphasized. That is true. However, there has been some element of rigmarole, if I may use that word, if you permit me to use the word. And the rigmarole, we know where it's coming from. The momentum was on. There had been postponements and rescheduling of the dates for the launch of the ECO. And suddenly, the Francophone countries led by Cote d'Ivoire came up and said, oh, they were going to transform the CFA franc into the ECO, with the French Central Bank playing a leading role, and other countries, especially those that belong to the West African monetary zone, principally Anglophone countries in West Africa, except for Guinea, Conakry, who though Francophone does not use the the CFA franc. And they kicked against it. Nigeria was vehement about that and insisted that certain criteria must be met and all. Initially also there was delay because for the 10 criteria, 4 primary and 6 secondary criteria, very few countries were able to meet the criteria within the stipulated time, and that caused the initial delays until the Ivorian card was played along, and then there was a hiccup, and now a rescheduling for 2027. We hope that all interest will be put on the table, sorted out, and the new date will be a realistic one.
With France having a tight grip, sort of, on 8 of these West African countries that use the franc CFA, how realistic really is meeting this 2027 target, looking at the conditions, you know, that is required to be met for the ECO to come to fruition?
My perspective on that is France haven't tasted the sweet nectar of having to have all Francophone African countries domicile their foreign exchange account with the French Central Bank. Will not, and the gains that she enjoys from all of that will not be willing to so easily give up such a privilege in his sphere of interest across the African continent. So I want to believe that our policymakers, our policy practitioners, those who are going to implement this policy will have to exert themselves further in order to be able to implement this against the French interest that is overtly displayed at each and every occasion.
Could you now say that it's perhaps a delusion, considering that the countries under this CEFA, that use this CEFA, constitute almost majority of the African countries in ECOWAS, about 8 of them out of 15?
Yeah, well, there may, in terms of numerical strength, they are there in terms of the number of countries that represent the Francophone countries in the west coast of Africa. But in terms of GDP, what do they have? I believe that Nigeria's GDP alone overwhelms all of them put together. So that is where the role of Nigeria becomes very important. Is an imperative, therefore, that we exact our weight in a positive manner in order to have this thing take off and be an example and set an example for other regional blocs within the African continent, preparatory for a continental single currency, as the case may be.
Well, another initiative aimed at boosting intra-Africa trade is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which was assented to by many of the African countries, almost all of them, I believe. How far do you see that going with the whole idea of the single currency, now that we do not have that? Do you think that it's something that it can really achieve the desired results?
I believe, yes, it can achieve the desired results, but which comes first, or which is supposed to come first? A single currency or a free trade area? I believe, in my conviction, that a free trade area should come in first, and as we go on, the imperative for a common currency may come on board. But for a free trade zone to be successful, we have to set up certain blocks in order not to encourage dumping. I am saying this with all sense of responsibility because I know that there are certain elements that take advantage of the ECOWAS rules of origin, which stipulates that if any good, if it can be proven that a particular good has about 80% of its component parts sourced from West African country, or any West African country or group of countries, that good should enjoy free duty entry in all of ECOWAS member countries. And we know, serving in Singapore, that smugglers will smuggle palm oil from Indonesia, from Malaysia, in both shiploads, tanker loads, anchor in the West African country, but relabel them as coming from those neighboring African countries only for the Nigerian market, stifling our own oil palm production policy.
All right. Well, just to get your concluding thoughts, Mr. Ogbole, on this whole conversation, there's a target here. By 2063, the AU would have been 100 years, and which is why the whole idea of the Agenda 2063 came up. Do you see some of the targets that have been set ahead of that date being realized?
I want to believe that the entire continental body, the African Union, and the affiliate regional bodies, including of ECOWAS, have to redouble their effort if we are to meet Agenda 2063. The reason is obvious. Each time a target is set, at the appropriate time, and you look back and do an assessment of this, we discover that only very few countries have been able to inch forward in meeting the targets. So if we look at the antecedents, and project it forward, the picture is not very encouraging. So there needs for hard work, real hard work, in terms of policy formulation. Not only that, beyond policy formulation, policy execution, in order for us to be able to meet the details of Agenda 2063.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ogbole Ode, Nigeria's former ambassador and also former spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for joining us on Africa Update and sharing your thoughts here.
Thank you for having me on your program.
All right. You're watching Africa Update on Trust TV, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. Coming up after the break, we'll take a look at 200 years old Sierra Leone's iconic Curtain 3 felled by storm. Join us again. Now, as part of efforts to support Africa's goal of strengthening...
Now, looking at the activity chart, as you can see right here, a total volume of 130...
Created a Boko Haram crisis that at that time was restricted to Yobe.
How secure are they? You can see security men with blood.
This is the road leading up to the...
Already, if you look at England squad, you are looking at EPL, you are looking at their names. You are not looking at...
All right, thank you for staying with us. You're watching Africa Update on Trust TV, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. Now, talking about the Africa Day, we would like to take the views of some Africans about what they think about the Africa Day and what they know about Africa Day.
Never. This is going to be my first day to hear about it.
I've not been aware of that there's a day like Africa Day, but as you put it rightly, the day is there.
We should start by grassroots sensitization to create awareness that this day exists. So once it gains relevance, it is easier now to tell people to celebrate it.
The only culture holding the whole world together is from Africa. When you talk of culture in diversity, it is Africa.
We've not made progress. We're not even united. There's injustice everywhere, no love. So I don't think it was it. Nothing. Africa has not gotten anything.
African Day is a day where Africans come together to celebrate and to remember the history of Africans who were once slaves to the Western community. And I believe that it's a day that we understand and celebrate our history and our culture.
When we say African Day, we're talking about the identity of the African and the total emancipation of the African continent. We're talking about economic-wise, the social upliftment and the political and geopolitical emancipation of the African continent.
Well, there you have it, a cross-section of Africans giving their view on what they think about the Africa Day. Well, let's take a look at another story now. An iconic landmark in the Sierra Leone capital, Freetown, a 100-year-old towering cotton tree has been brought down by a heavy storm. Take a look.
Witnesses at the scene describe it as chaotic. The tree fell directly onto a taxi, causing significant damage. Eyewitnesses report that the incident occurred Wednesday night as heavy rainfall engulfed the city. The curtain tree, located at the heart of Freetown, has long been regarded as a cultural and historical landmark revered by both locals and visitors alike. Its fall has sent shockwaves through the country, evoking a mix of nostalgia, sadness and concern for the affected taxi driver. President Julius Maada Bio has described it as a great loss to the nation, adding that the tree was regarded as a symbol of liberty and freedom by early settlers. The iconic tree also appears on Sierra Leone banknotes. According to local media, the curtain tree is said to be the oldest of its kind in the country, and it is the site where formerly enslaved people are said to have founded the city. President Bio has said there will be something at the same spot to represent the great curtain tree's place in the country's history.
Well, I can only imagine sad moment for the people of Sierra Leone. That's a very significant tree. It's not just any tree, So, well, this brings us to the end of Africa Update for this week. In case you've missed, you can always catch up across all our social media platforms and also on our YouTube live stream. I am Ayuba Ilya. Thanks for watching.